My name is Dan Guido, and I work for Trail of Bits, which is a security startup based out of New York, and I'm here with...
I'm Mike Arapaya. I work for ISEC Partners, which is a security consulting firm based out of San Francisco with offices in New York and Seattle.
Okay. And today, we are talking about mobile exploits. What we're doing is an extension of recent talks on Intel-driven defense. There's a talk that I gave at Source Boston last year called the Exploit Intelligence Project, which looks at concrete data, actual attacks that are being performed on Windows desktops and tries to infer the future of those attacks from what's currently happening. And there was another sort of corresponding talk given by Dino Daizovi at the same conference called Attacker Math, where he worked out some of the incentive structure that attackers pay attention to when they perform these actions. So intelligence-driven, what does that mean? I work with a firm with Alexander Sodorov. Maybe some of you guys know him. He's a famous Bulgarian reverse engineer. By Intel-driven, we took him and sent him as a spy to Eastern Europe to collect data on mobile malware. So in reality, none of this is really necessary. We don't have to go and interrogate these people that are performing these attacks in order to collect this data. The great thing about actual attacks is they're actually being performed, and we can collect concrete information about what is being performed and look at the reasons why that was done to build a model of the attackers that are performing those actions. And then with that model, we can inform our decisions and try to predict what their future behavior is going to be. This is more hypothetical, less hypothetical, and more concrete than what most security professionals do. The talk today is going to be focused on the iOS and Android client platforms, so the mobile operating systems and the data on them. There's a ton of information here, and the people that know me in this room know that I've been trying to assemble all of the information in this talk for the last couple days. There's a lot of information to get through, and we're likely going to follow this up with future talks that expand on the information in this one. So the latest version you'll always be able to find over at my website, over at trailofbits.com. So while we're talking today, if anybody has any comments, if anybody hears us say something funny, if anybody wants to disagree with us, you can tweet at us. These are our Twitter handles, and hashtag it mobileEIP so that I can get it easily on my phone. Okay, so the thesis of the talk here is that mobile devices are loading up with private data. We have things like email, sensitive login credentials, and line of business applications that enterprise companies are interested in writing or have written already. Everybody knows this. I don't really need to go over it. That's why there were about 5 or 6 different mobile talks at this conference. Everybody's interested in finding ways possible to get into that data. And there are tons of possibilities, right? Mobile phones are like small computers. They have near-field wireless. They have insecure data storage. People at RSA last month demonstrated that Tempest attacks were possible to remotely retrieve credit card numbers and other keys from emanations inside chips. There's tons and tons of possibilities. But from the concrete data, we see that actually very few of these possibilities are being explored. Mobile malware today is exploring very small numbers of attack vectors, not the ones that are being discussed at conferences. So really what we need to do is we need to find the sweet spot. We need to find the spot at which the attacks are actually happening. What attacks do I need to defend against now? Because any investment I make in defending against attacks should have the most possible return. And if I'm defending against attacks that don't exist, then what am I doing? So what we're doing here is we're trying to split up the actual versus the probable versus the possible. Security is, at conferences like these, is normally about the possible. It's possible for me to hack into this, but why would I want to? What would I get out of it? And that's what this presentation seeks to answer. And then finally, based on the actual and based on the possible, we try to determine the probable. Where are things going next? So Mike's going to explain a little bit about how we got this data and what we could tell with it.
So basically, we surveyed all of the mobile malware campaigns that we could find. So we surveyed hundreds of mobile malware campaigns. So for example, we have a few up there. So Droid Dream, for example, we took that and we would look at how is it distributed, what did it exploit on the device? Did it exploit the whole phone? Did it exploit other apps? Did it escalate privileges? What privilege escalation exploits did it use? And then once we found that, we focused on ones that escalate privileges, and we'll explain that in a few slides. And basically, once we looked at the privilege escalation exploits, we would look at certain things about them, like who wrote them, what did it target, who can we place the blame, like who wrote the insecure code that allowed that vulnerability to exist, what techniques did they use, what versions did it affect, and stuff like that.
Okay, so from the data, we got some very simple results. Just looking at the observable information in our data set, we've collected over 500 examples of attack campaigns that have been performed. Now, inside of each of these campaigns, we've only been able to identify 81 individual pieces of mobile malware. Inside of that 81, we've only been able to find 16 of them that actually escalate privileges to compromise data outside of that application sandbox on that phone. And then of all 16 malware families, every single one was delivered through the same attack vector. So like I said here, there are a very large number of possibilities, but very few explored actual events. Further, the 16 that did escalate privileges only used 3 different jailbreaks, 3 different exploits to escalate privileges, and there was only one person who was responsible for writing every single one of those 3. So, why is that? We're going to get into that, but this is starkly different, in stark contrast to the wide range of possibilities that people talk about at conferences today about mobile. So in order to understand this, we need to understand a little bit about the operating system architectures that we're dealing with. So I'm going to try and explain everything you need to know about iOS and Android in 2 slides. So first off, the Android security model is based on Linux. You have different user IDs and GIDs that separate applications. Apps can't access data from other applications because they're different users. The permissions model basically allows you to make IPC requests to other services on the phone. So when you install an application, it asks for the ability to dial a phone number. That's the ability to send an RPC request over to another process. That's all. That's it. There's no special things going on there. Besides that, though, the applications can access any other resources they want. They have full access to the kernel, to drivers, to system calls. They can run native code. It doesn't matter. Now, while applications are written in Java, they're run in a different VM. They're run in Dalvik, and Dalvik doesn't have what Java has with the sandbox or the security manager that restricts what code you can run. Any code can be run inside of an Android application. So the way this looks graphically is that applications can talk to other applications if they allow it, and then applications can talk to anything in kernel land if they want to. There's nothing stopping them. That's it. For iOS, it's very similar, but it's implemented a different way. So all the applications run as the same user. They run as the mobile user. However, all the applications are signed by Apple, and they're given a unique ID and a directory, and access to that directory is enforced by something called Seatbelt. Seatbelt enforces that separation between applications, and it also limits the attack surface of the kernel. So if any of you were at Vincenzo's talk yesterday where he talked about the Sandbox Odyssey, this is the same mechanism that's applied to iOS in order to restrict the number of things that you can talk to as a low-privileged application on a mobile device. So graphically, this works out that applications can't speak to each other at all, and there are very small, limited pathways from applications to the kernel. So what we know from this architecture basically is that privilege escalation is essential. If you compromise an application or you're running inside of one of these containers and you want to get all the data on the phone, you need to break out of that sandbox. You need to break out of that box that you're stuck in. And there's 2 ways to do that. On Android, you can give people permissions to essentially request your data, but this is something you're in control of. If you're an application developer, you can say, no applications can access my data. And this is something that most businesses are going to want to do if they're writing line of business applications, or if a bank has a sensitive pitch book or something that they have on that device, they're not going to share it willingly. The way that they're going to get that data compromised is if another application gets compromised, escalates privileges, and avoids that security barrier entirely. So the rest of this talk, we only really care about attacks that gain access to data in other applications, that gain access to mail, that gain access to login credentials, that gain access to other application data. We're not concerned with attacks that don't compromise data. There are many of them. There's toll fraud applications that sign you up for premium SMS. All these sorts of things are being ignored for now. We're dealing with one very specific threat, and that's the threat to the sensitive information I have stored on the phone. So to discuss this further and why this is important, let's look at two recent attacks.
So two recent attacks that we're going to look at is the Jester's mobile attack and CloudStrike's demo at RSA. So first, if we look at Jester, what he did was basically download public exploit code and changed it around a little bit so it worked for him and added some iOS support. He changed the avatar on his Twitter icon to a QR code, which you can scan, and it would lead you to a link where that exploit would execute. So he delivered the exploit, and then on Connect, he executed a local root exploit and tried to steal Twitter data and exfiltrate that Twitter data only if you were like a certain user. So he was like saving the world, of course, right?
All right, so why did this work? You know, we discussed that on your iPhone specifically, we have a very tight sandbox, right? And it's very difficult to escalate privileges. I can't access the information from other applications. So if I compromise the browser process, I can't access your Twitter data. That's protected. However, you know, this is what your iPhone is normally. This is your iPhone on jailbreaks. Once you've jailbroken the phone, a number of things change. We have a number of mitigations that turn off that we'll go into more detail later. But all of these things make the attack much simpler, and it made it much easier for Jester to port the exploit code over to a different platform. He didn't have to bypass these mitigations. Then on iOS, he doesn't even have to use a local root exploit. All he has to do is request the data from the other application or open the file on the desktop, or not on the desktop, on the shell, which exists because you jailbroke the phone. Normal iOS phones do not have a shell, but you get one installed when you jailbreak it. And then he also didn't mention that this attack only works on very, very old versions of both of these mobile devices. So on iOS, this browser exploit was patched in version 4.2.1, whereas 5.1 is current. And it was patched in Android 2.2, so it only works in 2.0 and 2.1, which are both very old, and only 6% of devices are running those versions. So what we can learn from here is that public exploit code is not so great for mobile devices right now. The quality is quite low. And also it requires privilege escalations in order to get that data. So if you jailbreak your phone, you're not doing something smart. All right.
So now, like 2 weeks ago at RSA in San Francisco, CrowdStrike demonstrated how APT would exploit a mobile device. So basically what they did was send a text message to a user. User clicks that, it opens up a URL, they exploit the browser. Your browser is hacked by that mask guy, and they install an application through the browser. And if we look at the permissions that the browser has, they couldn't just do that. So they needed to use they needed to escalate privileges and use a local root exploit. So they didn't specify that they did that, but they had to. So they probably used Gingerbreak, although they didn't specify. And the only reliable public jailbreak that works on less than 2.3.4 is Gingerbreak. And so you can access any of the functionality of the device after you jailbreak it. So you can install backdoors, you can record phone calls, you can monitor text, all the things that they demoed on stage. Now those are both possible under the right circumstances, but there's no evidence that APT has done that at all. We can only take guesses that this is what's happening, but we don't have empirical data to prove that this is what's happening. So if we're doing this, if we're trying to defend against APT doing this, we're wasting resources defending against things that don't actually exist.
Yeah, you're not necessarily wasting resources, but it may not be the most efficient because these attacks don't exist right now. And it's very similar to other mobile security talks where we say this is possible, but we don't know if it's happening yet. We want to focus on the actual right now and fix those issues first, and then from those issues we can extrapolate the probable next actions. Right. So we talked a little bit about APT. There are other attack groups out there. Let's take a look at the incentives of these different attack groups to actually perform these actions. So this is my easy way of explaining this. There's a number of different attack groups on the internet, and they all have different incentives, different data that they want to collect. So APT up at the top, they compromise the smallest volume of attacks, but they collect the most valuable information. So they invest more resources into those attacks that are performed. They collect intellectual property, things that make up the basis of a company's ability to profit. Now these guys, they have a great thing going right now. They are able to get at all this intellectual property very easily through Windows desktop computers. And this is how we see them attacking those computers. We haven't seen them go to mobile yet because they might not have a reason to. They may in the future, but they don't right now. So we're going to leave this shelved on the side and talk about the attacks that actually do happen. Now, lower we have credit card data theft, card data theft, CDT. These are groups of essentially financial crime gangs that want to go after databases of credit card numbers. They want to collect 100 million credit cards at one time. Now, if these guys want to go after mobile, they need to get the same effect. So how many people in the room have 100 million credit cards on their phone? Right? So these guys are not exactly interested in going after mobile devices. However, mass malware is going to fit into a pattern of attack that makes sense here. They go after they go after clients. They go after one credential at a time, and they abuse them on a massive scale. They're responsible for the largest number of volume of attacks, and they collect the least valuable information, but they collect a lot of it. So this is the group that we're going to talk about today, and this is the group that we see primarily responsible for mobile attacks today. So from the discussion of the mobile operating system architectures, we know that an attack is built out of two pieces. We have to gain access to the phone, and then we need to break out of the sandbox on the phone. So the cost of an attack is built from the cost of the vector to gain access and the cost of the jailbreak to escalate access. And then because we're dealing with financially motivated attackers, we know that in order for it to be a useful attack, they need to gain more revenue than they spent in performing the attack. So the cost of the attack needs to be less than the potential revenue, or else they won't attack at all. So normally, in security, we deal with the possible, we deal with the ease of exploitation. The ease of exploitation. Can somebody yell out other things that might affect the cost of an attack? What would make it easy to attack a mobile phone? If I knew I wasn't going to get caught, or if I could do it again and again, if I had an established process that already works where I could swap out components. So if I know how to target client systems, if I know how to compromise websites, then I may be able to do this very easily. Now, potential revenue is something that we completely ignore. But it's a big deal to this particular group of attackers because they need to make back their money. They need to have enough targets. They need to collect information that's valuable, and they need to be able to monetize it. They can't go out and collect 250,000 Yelp credentials. That's not really going to help them that much. Okay, so based on this, we know that there are a couple different pathways that a mobile malware group could take. This is what it looks like to them. They have internet access, they want to get money, they have to gain access to the phone through one of a couple of different vectors that we're going to go over. They need to escalate privileges, and then from that they can make money, right? To us, looks like this, right? We have a website with advertisements all the way on the left. We have a backdoor application all the way up on the top. We have mobile advertisements on the right. That's a way that I could potentially reach a large number of mobile phones. And then we have something that I call close access. Basically anything that requires me to be in physical proximity, up to and including punching somebody in the face and stealing their phone. So with malware, with this widespread mass malware, we already have a business model that works very well with malicious advertisements. So let's see how this process plays out on mobile. We have mobile ads, they reach a large number of phones. Each of the two vendors that we're talking about right now has their own program for doing it. But there's a couple things that need to happen for me to be able to abuse these systems. So first off, I can't get caught. If I'm out in Eastern Europe or wherever or somewhere where these attacks are generally being performed from, I can't have Apple call me up on the phone and be like, "Hello, I am Boris Yeltsin. I would like to buy malicious ads." Instead, we need to do this anonymously. We need to do it through an online form where we can just type in information. And this happens to be the case on only one ad vendor. We need it to be low cost. The general amount of money that we're dealing with in this industry is very low. In my previous presentation, most of the exploit kits that we discussed that target desktop systems are available for less than $2,000. That's sort of the price point that we need to hit. That's a good maximum. With Apple, you have to prepay $300,000 in order to get into their iAd program. With AdMob, we have a $50 minimum, so this is looking good. The next thing that I want is I want to be able to exploit every single phone as soon as they open my advertisement, just like they do on desktops. As soon as they browse to a page that has my ad at the top, I want to pop that browser and gain access to that computer. That's only possible if I can insert scripting code or something dynamic into that vector. Now in IAD, this is possible. They have full HTML5 and they use WebCore to render all this stuff, which is great. However, AdMob doesn't. All you can do is a link, all you can do is text, all you can do is an image. But that might still be okay if there's enough targets. And the issue here is that legitimate advertisers don't even want to buy these services. It's not a proven method to target many people on mobile phones because not too many people click them, how many applications actually run them. So what we see is that IAD's probably not going to be exploited, right? Because the cost of exploitation is extremely high. I have to give them a real identity, I have to speak to them on the phone, I have to pay them $300,000. The access I get as a result is great. I can definitely take over phones, but how many phones can I take over? AdMob might work out. So we do actually have one case where somebody did this. It's something called GG Tracker, and it was used for SMS fraud. It didn't escalate any privileges, so we're just kind of leaving this as an anecdote. And apparently it didn't work that well because it wasn't tried again. It was done in mid-2011, and there's been no repeats since. So we think that this is mildly attractive, and it may be revisited in the future, but only if the incentives change, only if more applications use them or if scripting access is granted. But we don't see it being abused in that high volume or really in any volume for the considerable future. Another access vector we have is close access. So this is all the insecure storage, NFC, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. Charlie Miller doing NFC research. What does it mean? Are all of our phones going to be exploited every time we walk into our favorite coffee shop? So attacks that require close access generally don't scale. They're very hard to exploit on a massive scale, but there is one that scales very, very well. Can anybody think of a close access besides me punching you in the face? I don't think that scales really well. It would take me a long time to get to each person here. Does anybody know of one close access attack that scales extremely well that you're very likely to run into in your normal life? Really? Credit card skimmers. They're cheap, mag stripes are ubiquitous, and they have access to the data that I want. These scale because of the incentives. They all work out. Like whenever you pay for services, you have to have a credit card. Credit cards have mag stripes. Everybody's got them, right? So the target set is enormous. And the card skimmers themselves are extremely cheap. We can get these for a couple of dollars, and they come with documentation. Non-technical people can use them, right? Is the same thing true for close access on phones? Probably not. Most of these technologies are not as ubiquitous. How many people in here have NFC phones? Yeah, like 1%, 5%, whatever, something tiny. It's not enough targets to actually exploit. And then how many times are those NFC phones actually active on NFC? And then what applications use them? Like if NFC becomes popular in the future to run a massively multiplayer online game, I don't think they're going to be as exploited as magstripes are, which has access to credit card information that I can immediately abuse. So the thing here is that cost of exploitation is also not dirt cheap. It's not commoditized. I can't go on the internet and purchase a $5 device to perform this kind of attack. And that's what I need to make it scale to the levels that these sort of mass malware groups need them to be at. This is an enormous issue for baseband exploitation. It will only, like that attack vector will only be exploited by people that aren't interested in compromising large numbers of targets. And then the risk of arrest due to physical proximity is unchanged in this situation. I have to get close to you. I have to pick up the device. I have to plant the device somewhere. And all this means that I have a chance of getting arrested, which is really not cool. Yep, right. So in the data, we see 0 cases of this actually being performed right now. Next vector, mobile browsing. Right? Mobile browsing is how most people predict that these kinds of attacks are going to happen because it's very easy to imagine. It's both easy to imagine and possible, right? So it all comes down to, is it profitable? Is there enough potential revenue there? So if we take a look at statistics from advertising vendors, we see that only about 8% of the web is due to mobile traffic. 8% of the URLs loaded on the web is due to mobile traffic. And this is further segmented down by the devices that are actually browsing. So we have iOS phones, Symbian phones, BlackBerry phones, Android, different versions of each, and they all have different feature support. Some of them have Flash, some of them don't. We can't rely on uniformity among all of them, whereas it's pretty uniform if 99% of people run Flash on desktops or 75% of people run Java on desktops. Another problem you might have is that mobile websites typically don't display ads. So on the left, we have a normal website viewed as the normal website. In the middle, we have the mobile website. And on the right, we have a mobile app. And the one in the center doesn't have any ads. So it means we're basically restricted to compromising websites instead of purchasing ads, which is very simple and easy. So if we look at this in terms of our attacker math, we have 10 to 20% less potential, 10 to 20 times less potential targets than desktops. There aren't many mobile browsers on the internet right now, and they're split between different platforms, so it's hard to target them. And then it's also hard to get our code onto these mobile websites because many of them don't have ads. So their increased cost has less potential revenue. These attacks are not happening. They're possible, but they're not happening. It might change if the number of targets rises dramatically, but the attack vectors that we see exploited in the data today is still something different. So let's talk about vendor app stores. These are the principal difference between mobile and desktop OSs, but not for long. All the problems that I'll discuss here are coming to your desktops very soon. There's a huge number of potential targets on app stores. On each app store, we have access to over 300 million devices that have that store built into them. So this starts to look like it's a pretty good value proposition, right? There are less costs to exploit because we don't have to gain access to an application. We just get people to install them. There's no extra exploit needed. We can submit apps for nearly free. Paying to get into these developer programs is cheap. And manipulation of SEO is simple and easy. I may be able to just hitch a ride on a public current event to get people to install my application, which is common in other areas. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. The app submission process on iOS, we have to do a number of things in order to submit an application. First, we have to join the iOS developer program. Cost me 99 bucks. Whatever, I have 99 bucks. Next, Apple identifies your identity. They verify your identity. If any of you have ever signed up to these programs, they force you to give them a copy of your social security number, a passport number, a driver's license. If you are a company, they ask for your articles of incorporation, a DUNS number. All these sort of things pin down an application and pin down an identity and relate it to all the applications that are uploaded. After you've got a verified identity, you can upload code. However, it's all reviewed for content. Seems like most of it by a human, and then it's also checked via static analysis for things like banned APIs and probably known exploits. And then finally, no runtime modification is allowed. All the code is signed by Apple. You can't change anything once it gets onto the device. On the flip side, we've got Android. Android has about 300 million devices, I think. That's what they say. The developer agreement is slightly cheaper. It's 25 bucks, but it didn't matter anyway. I get to fill out my information on a form online. I don't really have to talk to anybody because Google wants the platform to be open. The apps are reviewed through dynamic analysis. Google made a big deal about this when they published it a few weeks ago. They have this system now called Bouncer, and the way that it runs is it runs the application in their cloud somewhere, and then verifies that the activity it performs is not malicious. But it doesn't sound like they're actually statically verifying functionality by looking at the code. And then finally, runtime modification is allowed. There's no specific mitigation on Android that prevents me from dynamically updating the code inside of that application and bypassing the review process entirely. So from the attacker's perspective, what does this look like? If I want to submit an application to the iOS App Store, I have to make a believable false identity or risk arrest because Apple will definitely go after you and they'll definitely ban you for life. And it's expensive to create a false identity every time you want to do this. I have to make a believable app that passes a content review because most of these are reviewed by a human. I have to avoid banned APIs that might be useful, and I also have to avoid known exploits because Apple would be stupid not to be checking for them. Right? After all that, then I can finally submit my malicious application. So cost to exploit here is very high. On the other hand, we have Android. In Android, I have to put fake information into a form online, which I'm sure nobody in the room knows how to do. I have to avoid malicious application until Google is done running my application, until after they've run it, right? So I can do this two ways. I can package my malicious activity inside the application and just wait a while for it to execute or have some other trigger that makes it execute. Or I can have it outside the application, issue a dynamic update or download and execute anything and then run the malicious code at runtime, right? So it's much easier for us to abuse the Android App Store than it is for the iOS App Store. So the proof is in the data, right? Which of these mitigations work and how effective are they? With the data that we've collected, we see that there are 0 malicious applications that have ever exploited Apple phones and stolen data in the Apple App Store. On the Google Marketplace, we've seen 30 separate malware families do it. So say what you will about police states, but they have very little crime. Right. There's another complication here. We have third-party app stores. Third-party app stores may be attractive to abuse, right, if there's enough potential targets. In the past, we've seen indications that about 10% of total devices use these third-party markets. But in a strange reversal, in certain regions, they may actually dominate. In China, for example, people don't typically read English, so they don't want to use Android's app store. They go use a third-party one that caters to them. So the cost of exploitation here needs to be very low unless the number of potential targets is very high. So for iOS, this is great. This works well because access to a third-party market means that the device is already jailbroken, so the cost of exploitation might be lower. And then also we know that third-party app markets, because they're smaller, have less of an ability to review content. So it may be easier to get the app into the store. The way we see this playing out, we have large numbers of malicious applications in all third-party markets everywhere. In the US, less people use third-party markets, so less people exploit them. In China, more people use third-party markets, more people exploit them, all based on number of targets. So after my long-winded attack vector discussion, we basically have tried to prove that, look, the cost of attack is based on these two different variables, and it's possible for us to increase the cost of the vector so high that it's not targeted. But what if, the cost of the jailbreak plays into this? Can we take it out somehow? So what if we reduce the cost of jailbreak to 0, and they're free, and we can get them anywhere? Would app stores still be abused in this scenario? I would say absolutely not for iOS. The identity verification, the application review, and the code signing policies make it extremely difficult. However, Google has none of these things, and everywhere they are missing them is where they're being exploited, including on AdMob. So what if browser exploits were free too? This is not a hypothetical situation. Browser exploits are free, and they have been free for a long time. We've seen this on Android. Jailbreak Me made it true on iOS, but these things were not abused by malware. Security researchers said they could do it. They even proved they could do it. But the number of potential targets was not enough. So this means that either there's a high amount of patching to reduce the number of vulnerable targets, or there's a low amount of surfing. There's just not enough people there. So let's take a look at a little bit of what it takes to write an exploit for these different devices, and a little bit about the systems that have arisen to exploit them. On Android, we have an active jailbreaker community, and there's tons of free exploits available. Right now, we've collected a data set of 26 separate jailbreaks from 10 different authors. And what it comes down to is that as soon as the phone gets popular, it gets jailbroken, no questions. The sandbox that Google has doesn't actually make exploitation harder. And the permissions that you choose when you install the application don't do anything to mitigate the attack surface that's exposed. So all these jailbreaks are extremely simple to write and very quick to write. The authors, these 10 guys, can usually turn them around in a day or two. And then there's no clearinghouse for Android vulnerability info. It's very difficult for me to go to a random Android phone and figure out whether it's vulnerable to one jailbreak or not, because the vendors aren't saying. And the reality is that many of them aren't patched for many of the existing exploits. There's a serious lack of info because these vendors refuse to track this information, and this is a situation that needs to change and might be changing soon, hopefully based on this. So what is Google doing to make this harder? Well, if you want to get one of these exploits, first, I guess you need to learn English to learn how to use Google itself to search for the jailbreaks on the internet. That could be considered a mitigation. And then Google's also trying to ask carriers to unlock the bootloaders so people don't have a need to write these jailbreaks, but that isn't so successful. So kind of a big failure here. There's not a lot stopping you from writing these jailbreaks, and there is a huge need, so there is a huge community. Let's take a closer look at the people actually writing them. We have the 10 authors down here, and we put an 11th over on the right side, malware authors, where you can see we're responsible for developing 0 of them. So just like on desktops, we see a similar situation emerging where all of the exploits that are abused are exploits that are released by security researchers. The malware community has no demonstrated capability to actually develop their own exploit code or find their own vulnerabilities. Now, I took the exploits here and split them into 2 groups. I split them into groups based on prevalence of the targets. So on the right, the red affects a particular handset. So it's an exploit, it's a jailbreak that works on a Zoom tablet or a Nexus S or some other specific device. On the right, on the blue, we have universal Android exploits that affect every single Android device in existence. There's a smaller number of those, and there are very few people releasing them. So I'm just going to suppose here that the ones that are being exploited in the wild, that are being abused by malware, are of this set in the blue. Okay? So let's take a closer look at those. Here they are. Anybody want to take a guess which ones get abused before I unveil it? Well, so first off, we can eliminate 2 of them. We can get rid of ZergRush and we can get rid of MempoDroid. Despite having version support for the latest version of Android, right? You think that would be the most attractive. These exploits, while they affect every single version of Android, they require offsets for each specific handset. So I have to have manual configuration. Even this tiny bit of manual configuration makes them unattractive. Those are not abused. The remaining ones that are only the major releases. So we have one exploit abused for 2.1, one for 2.2, and one for 2.3. And this highlights some of the patching problems that Google has. It's very difficult for them to increment between minor versions of Android releases. So it's really only necessary for me to exploit the first one. So you see down here with Levitator, they affect 2.3.5, but that's not useful enough. There's not enough targets. I can still use Gingerbreak, and I can use it very effectively. A little bit of a closer look at patch stats. This is what Google publishes themselves. I'm sure everybody's seen this information. A little bit of an issue here that most people don't get into is that the patching, the distribution numbers are only by API level because this is supposed to help developers. We can't actually determine how many devices in the wild have exactly 2.3.5. We don't know how many are patched for Rage Against the Cage versus not, because they're all grouped into these large sets of 4 minor patch releases. Some interesting information that's been released in this area was by Lookout. Lookout is a mobile security vendor. Basically, the information here to take away is that Google is not in control whatsoever of when carriers and OEMs patch their handsets. It doesn't matter when the patch hits the Android open source repository, so Google could patch it in 2 days, but it needs the carrier to push that update in order for the user to get it, right? And these groups of people, they treat the handsets as disposable items right now. Rather than patch it, they want you to buy a new one. So Lookout tracked this information. They asked the question, how many days did it take for 50% of all of our users, which are millions of people, how long did it take for 50% of those users to patch their devices, to get a patch from the OEM, from the carrier? And for the exploits that we've got listed here, which are very old, these things affect an enormous amount of devices that are in the wild because the devices they support have been purchased for months. It took almost a year for each, for 50% to patch. So there's an enormous number of targets that are available with just these public exploits. And then finally, let's say the situation changes. Let's say that Google can patch immediately. They shift entirely to the iOS system where they can push down a patch and everybody updates, right? That would solve everything. The issue here is that jailbreakers are quite strategic. This is Stealth prior to releasing an exploit that he called Gingerbreak that affected the latest version of Android at the time. Now, even though it affected the latest version, he didn't want to release it because he wanted more versions to come out and for more versions to be in the wild until he could release his jailbreak and it would work for everybody. They want to maximize their potential revenue, so they strategically withhold exploits, withhold information that they have until they're actually useful. So the moral of the story here is that as soon as the patch version becomes widely distributed, there will be another exploit, and exploits are extremely simple to write for Android. Now that's not all, right? It gets better. Because a lot of the malware we see doesn't even have to escalate privileges with the jailbreak sometimes. Google has all these little corner cases that allow applications to escalate their privileges without actually exploiting the kernel. There's something called Android private signing keys. So if you make a custom ROM in the Android open source project, you have to sign that custom ROM somehow to get it onto the phone. Now they have like essentially test keys that are open, that are like public as like an example, and some of these are mistakenly used by different custom ROMs. So somebody just took this open private signing key and then signed their app with it so that when it gets installed, it already has elevated privileges. There's a very low target set for this because it's only the people that use custom ROMs. Like how many people in here run CyanogenMod? Like one? Yeah, one? Great. Another scenario here, another tactic, is to have the user do it themselves. So sometimes you're too lazy to even download and execute the code. This screenshot here is from a piece of malware called Lena, and the instructions, which you can't read, say, if your phone is not rooted, please use Super One-Click or Rage Against the Cage GUI to root it. And then once you root it, it takes over the phone because it can just SU to root and then you're done. Another neat new thing that we've seen exploited once in the wild is also the Device Administration API, which was, thankfully introduced by Google to support enterprise customers. What this does is it allows essentially a special permission that applications can request that allow it to take over control of all the settings on the device. It's supported in versions 2.2 and higher, and it's been abused by Droid Live. The permissions give you really scary warnings about what the application can potentially do. It'll say this application can remote wipe your device, but it's a discretionary control, and discretionary controls are bypassed. So all these applications were distributed through app markets, first and third party. These different strategies are less effective because most of them require user interaction or they have less affected users like the signing keys issue. So they're less used, but they still work, right? So there's many possibilities here. On Android, though, there's still more paths to data. Lots of people are concerned about the app-to-app vector, and lots of consulting is going on right now about the app-to-app vector. But when we're specifically talking about mass malware, we're talking about large amounts of potential revenue needed. And these types of attacks only give you very specific credentials. If I already have code running on the device, if I put through all the work to install a malicious application, I am not going to be satisfied with somebody's Yelp credentials. I need to get all their data. I need to get their mail. I need to get their banking information. The targets that are available here are simply not enough. So the question you have to ask yourself is, are there more app installs of one particular application than there are of one particular handset? Because these same groups are not abusing handset-specific exploits, so why would they abuse application-specific exploits, right? And then finally, there's huge issues with monetization. So the prime targets of these have already been burned by this. They already know. Banks already sort of know that this attack vector exists. If you heard from Veracode yesterday, these are like one of the largest consumers of security consulting and security investment. So the targets are all these random applications that are written by small teams of developers, people that I can't immediately monetize. Remote to app has similar problems, right? If I want to exploit individual applications, what's the vector? Can I actually reach that application? How many applications register URL handlers that I can call them through? It's very difficult to find a large enough number of targets. So in the data, we see no evidence of app-to-app or remote-to-app. These attacks are not happening now for mass malware. What does this look like in the future? Is this going to change? So lots of people are trumpeting the ASLR that was introduced in Ice Cream Sandwich 4.x, right? Chrome for Android is coming out. Chrome for Android is extremely difficult to exploit, or so they say. And then there's a new project by the NSA called the SE Android project, which had a really great presentation, actually, tons full, like chock full of great information. I have a reference at the end of our slides, where they claim to be able to prevent every single jailbreak that's effective on Android devices today. But the reality of the matter is that Chrome is making browser exploits hard when the browser is not being exploited right now. We're trying to defend against attacks that don't exist yet. SE Android kills user space jailbreaks, but not kernel jailbreaks, right? A lot of the jailbreaks that are taking place on Android are in user space because those are easier for the time being, but this doesn't completely eliminate that attack vector. Jailbreaks are still possible. It's still probable. It's still important for jailbreakers to be able to jailbreak phones. So they'll likely retract slightly, delay a little bit while they have to retool, learn new techniques, and then they'll be releasing a constant stream yet again. So SE Android won't fundamentally change the game. And then ASLR has little to no effect on jailbreaks. If you're running code locally, ASLR is not so much of an issue. And we've, like, taking a look at the actual exploit code of all the different jailbreaks that we've collected, ASLR affects very few of them out of the box. It's very useful to make browser exploits difficult. You know, that's great. But again, we're defending against things that don't exist yet, and it also can't help 300+ million devices. Google can't patch their devices. This only works in Ice Cream Sandwich 4.x. And if you remember from a few slides back, how many people actually run Ice Cream Sandwich? 1.6% of all devices in the wild, right? So this situation is not likely to change. So the takeaways here are that the only exploits abused are public jailbreaks. The malware community has no demonstrated ability to write their own, but they don't need to because Google makes it very easy. They don't make any attempt to mitigate them in the operating system. They don't track the vulnerabilities that allow them, so as an enterprise I can figure out how affected I am. None of their upcoming enhancements mitigate jailbreaks. They all focus on the browser. And the platform is filled with alternative escalation scenarios because all control is discretionary, not mandatory. So the patching situation is completely insane. The jailbreaks last forever once you create them. Google has no ability to force carriers and OEMs to patch. And even if they could, it's too easy to write new jailbreaks. So if patching was, down to every 4 days, it's very easy for me to write a jailbreak every 4 days based on the current situation. So what this means is the question from the last section, is it due to less browsing or is it due to less patching that browser exploits are not prevalent? Well, for here, it's definitely the case that it's due to not enough browsing. All right, now we're going to take a look at iOS.
All right, so we only have like 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and go fairly quickly. But so with Android, you see a lot of exploits being written by a pretty fair amount of people, and with iOS exploits, that's not the case. So there's a lot of exploits that have been written in iOS's lifetime, but they're only really written by 4 main groups. So there's the iPhone dev team, there's Comics, there's Pod2G, there's only a few groups that are writing these exploits, and there's no evidence of abuse by malware authors at all. There's never been an iOS exploit included in any malware that we've seen. Security researchers presenting at RSA and Black Hat don't count. However, jailbreak behavior mimics attackers. So when a jailbreak author is writing a jailbreak, they want the cheapest possible jailbreak and they want the most use. Right now, an iOS jailbreak takes like 6 months to write, and you're only going to get limited use out of it because of Apple's patch response, which we'll talk about in a bit. So obviously, they're going to start aiming for boot ROM, which is unpatchable, as opposed to iOS, which is quickly patchable. Because if I'm going to spend 6 months writing vulnerability, I'd rather write it such that it can't be patched. So there's a few exploit mitigations that iOS has implemented. So there's in 2008 when iOS 2.0 came out, they implemented complete code signing, which so apps had to be signed to execute and memory pages had to be signed at runtime. And like DEP, it prevents introduction of new code. So it was it's really effective. ASLR was introduced in iOS 4.3. However, apps need to be compiled with PIE support in order for this to work, and almost all third-party applications don't. If you saw Dino Daizovi's iOS talk last summer at Black Hat, he surveyed the top 10 free mobile applications on iOS, and none of them were compiled with PIE support. Although every app that comes with your iPhone when you get it, which are the most likely to be on users' devices, all are compiled with PIE support. And then there's the Seatbelt Sandbox, which if you saw Vincenzo's talk 2 days ago, he talked a lot about that, and he's much more of an authority on it than me. So if you want to look into that, read up on that. But basically, it restricts the kernel attack surface, and it increases the difficulty of finding kernel vulnerabilities by a lot. And there's nothing like that on Android for sure. So basically, the takeaway from that is exploiting iOS is no weekend task, right? You can't just open up your laptop on a Friday and have like a full iOS jailbreak by Sunday. It takes a lot of time. And I was talking to Comics yesterday, and he said it took him a while because he was lazy, but it took him several months to write Jailbreak Me 2.0. So basically, this is what it takes, really briefly, here are the steps an attacker needs to take to bypass those mitigations. Jailbreakers want the most possible benefit for the least possible work, so they're going to use a kernel exploit, which isn't that easy for sure. So as far as malicious iOS apps go, Apple needs to review your apps unless you can figure out a way to execute, to allow code injection at runtime. Browser exploitation is difficult, so let's look at apps instead. So first off, let's look at Charlie Miller and what he did a few months ago. And he found a vulnerability in the Mmap, and he exploited it using a stock trader app. So he embedded an Mmap logic floor into a legit-looking app and submitted it to the App Store with his real identity. So Charlie Miller has a social security number, he has a license, he has an identity, and he had an iOS developer account. So there is nothing for him to lose as a researcher by submitting this app to Apple. He's not going to get arrested, he's not going to get sued by Apple, or he didn't think he would get sued by Apple. And he was able to inject new code at runtime. Now, this is the only instance of potentially malicious content in the iOS App Store. Also, like Dan said before, Apple definitely has signatures of current exploits. So if you try to submit an app with,
We don't know, but they'd be stupid not to.
they probably do. But
I wouldn't risk it if I were you, because then you'll get banned for life, or like have the cops show up at your door.
So submitting an old jailbreak is probably not going to work. And would you really want to spend months developing your awesome iOS jailbreak and then submit it to the Apple App Store for them to review and look at and really admire and then signature? I wouldn't think so. So as Charlie Miller might say, might be better to ask for forgiveness, not permission. So that was awesome, and that was a really good exhibit of getting malware into the App Store. And I'm going to talk about why this doesn't matter at all. So there's a big difference between research and actual. So Charlie Miller, like I said, signed up with his real identity. He wasn't going to get arrested, and the cost vector was 0 for him. His malicious app relied on a specific vulnerability, and attackers in the past have no demonstrated discovery capabilities for those kinds of exploits. And the attack surface is probably really small, and there's probably, Charlie may have found the last bug of its type. So we don't know, but the attack surface is really small. Malware can't repeat this attack. Malware didn't abuse Charlie's attack. Why didn't this get abused? It's because Apple patched it in 4 days, reducing potential revenue. So Apple patched it in 4 days. It takes 2 weeks to get an app even approved. So it wasn't going to work. And also, Charlie didn't discuss the details or release any code until after the patch, and I don't think he's released any code to date. So browser-based attacks are clearly the winner here, primarily due to anonymity. You don't need a name, you don't need a social security number to put up a website. So like I was talking about before about Apple's response time, where they patched up Charlie's bug in 4 days. So Apple patches really fast and discourages repeat research for jailbreak. So if I spend 6 months developing a jailbreak and it's dead in a week, I'm going to be really upset. And that's pretty discouraging to repeat jailbreakers. And also, potential profit is sharply limited after a few days because iOS has a much better patch rate than Android, and users are patching fairly quickly, and we'll get to that in the next slide. But here's two other vulnerabilities, or two other exploits in Jailbreak Me 2 and 3, and they were both patched within a week to 2 weeks. So Apple's patch response is pretty quick. So if we look at iOS 5 patching rates, it's pretty impressive that 3 months after iOS 5 came out, 66% of all iOS users had updated to iOS 5. Now, that's a little skewed because some users of second generation devices like the iPhone 3G or the iPod Touch 2G can't patch. Their 4.2.1 is the last operating iOS version they can use. So the latest version of Android is on 1.6% of devices today. The latest version of iOS was on 66% of devices in January. So that's a pretty big difference. And the reason why it's important to be updated to iOS 5 from Apple's perspective is after iOS 5, all updates are OTA, over the air. So while OTA is not perfect, if you are on iOS 5, it's a lot easier for an end user to update their software by just clicking OK or update, instead of having to plug it into iTunes and wait 5 minutes for it to reboot and do its magic. And also, patching incentivizes unpatchable bugs in boot ROM, but no boot ROM exploits have come out since before iPad 2. So remaining bugs are probably pretty difficult to find, because if they weren't, they would be here. Like that's just facts. So let's talk about iOS app-to-app exploitation. iOS app-to-app exploitation, unless you jailbreak your device, doesn't really exist because of the seatbelt. So there's not much to say about that. So if we just talk about takeaways for a second, what we can take away from all those facts is that no malicious use of iOS jailbreaks by mass malware at all. There's never been any demonstrated ability by mass malware to write exploits, and that's something that we don't see happening. Despite availability of exploits, there's limited potential revenue for mass malware. So the cost of the jailbreak slows rate of discovery. So it takes longer to develop a jailbreak, so they come out less. And Apple has to react less, which means they can react better. Over-the-air updates allow the ability for Apple to immediately patch any vulnerabilities that do come out, which is awesome. And malicious app distribution is harder than just submission. So there's a lot of identity verification, there's code signing, and nearly the entire attack surface is absent. So.
All right, so we're cutting the talk here. I had no idea we'd actually be almost on time. That's kind of amazing. So the conclusions you can take away from this talk are that attackers carefully balance incentives with strategy. Or rather, not all attack vectors are going to be explored maliciously. Only the attack vectors that make sense are going to be massively exploited. And the intelligence-driven approach, the approach of actually collecting concrete data about what attacks are being performed in the wild and using that to infer probable next actions, is very rewarding and useful, as we've demonstrated today. So some of the results that we can take away, boiled down to just 6 bullet points here, are that Android is definitely has a bad future in front of it. They're going to be continued to be exploited by malicious applications through their App Store because it's easy, because the upcoming mitigations are not effective, and because their existing mitigations are not effective. The costs are too low, the potential revenue is too high. On iOS, we think that similar attacks are not going to happen. And this is from a combination of many different factors, but it boils down to real-world verification trumps all technical attacks. The fact that Apple relies upon the real identity of everybody before they submit applications to the App Store is a serious mitigating factor to malicious applications being submitted. So we see lots of manipulation of the App Store in other ways, but we don't see it in ways where people are distributing malicious applications. And then also what Mike just mentioned, that all the mitigations they have implemented in the iOS handsets make jailbreaking extremely difficult, so the numbers of them that come out are low, and then the ability of Apple to react is very fast. So the potential revenue drops very sharply as soon as jailbreak comes out. So we're going to be discussing this in the future in a line of talks, hopefully, where we discuss available defenses and what you can do to actually prevent many of these attacks. Like I firmly believe, I mentioned before that no APT attacks are happening now, but how do you expect to defend against the advanced persistent threat if you can't beat mass malware, if you can't stop getting compromised by accident, right? We have to sort of start somewhere. This is a great place to start. So we'll be exploring what actually works in the future. So if anybody wants to, I'll run through a couple references here. So we talked about attacker math. Dino also did a very detailed iOS security evaluation. My talk, the Exploit Intelligence Project. Lookout Mobile Security has great reading about all the different mobile threats that exist. Contagio Minidump collects almost every single sample of mobile malware that's been found in the wild, and you can download them. And then there's just tons of talks about Android. Because the possibilities, again, on this platform are endless, right? So we have John Oberheide giving talks, we have the NSA giving talks, Immunity gave some at Infiltrate. There's a great guy from NC State whose name I can't pronounce at all that likes to discover and collect new Android malware with very detailed write-ups that we were able to benefit from a ton. And then the AndroGuard database also collects descriptions and copies of all the different Android malware that exists. So I'll go back 2 slides now. We're right on time, but I think I have some time to take questions, if anyone has any. Or you can just yell at me on Twitter. That's fine.
Remember to fill out the feedback form, or else the dark tangent will kill us. We're not telling you.
Oh, we got a question in the front?
One question. By looking at this, everyone would buy an Apple product and not Android because Android is not safe. So
Yep.
do you think this will make Google react and do something like improving the situation?
Well, the factors that cause Android to be taken up are different than security, right? Like, I have an incentive to purchase my parents a phone that isn't going to get compromised by accident, but the reasons why people use Android phones are different. So these two things kind of don't really match up, and that's sort of all of security in a microcosm, isn't it? Anybody else want to ask anything? Okay, well, I'll be at lunch if anybody wants to come find me and tell me I'm wrong.